In 1987, a retired steelworker in Pittsburgh lived on $11 a week for groceries. He ate the same one-pot meal every night for 3 years. His doctor said his blood work was better than most men half his age. That meal is number 4 on this list. He learned it from his mother during the Depression. Number 18 costs less than $1.50. Number 9 was invented by a widow who could not stand long enough to cook 2 dishes. These 25 meals were designed for one thing: survival. They fed people eating alone at kitchen tables that used to seat 6, people stretching a social security check across 30 days and praying the math worked out. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 forgotten poor man, one-pot meals for seniors living alone. Number 25, tomato and bread soup. This was the meal that said, "I have almost nothing left in the cupboard, and I am still going to eat well tonight." A senior with half a loaf of stale bread and a can of tomatoes could make a supper that tasted like it came from a grandmother's kitchen in Tuscany. You tore the bread into rough chunks and dropped them into a pot with a can of crushed tomatoes, a clove of garlic, and enough water to loosen it. 20 minutes of simmering, and the bread dissolved into a thick porridge-like stew that was warming and filling and cost almost nothing. A pinch of salt, a drizzle of whatever oil you had, that was it. In the 1940s, Italian immigrants brought this to tenement kitchens in New York and Philadelphia, and it spread through neighborhoods where every penny mattered. Seniors who remembered it made it on nights when the cupboard was bare and the energy to cook was even barer. One pot, one burner, 15 minutes of standing, a full belly, and a warm kitchen. Modern food writers rediscovered it, called it ribollita and charged $18 a bowl in Manhattan. Your grandmother called it supper. Number 24, potato and onion stew. If you grew up poor in Appalachia, you knew this meal. 2 potatoes, 1 onion, a knob of butter or a spoonful of bacon, grease, water, and salt. That was the whole recipe. You sliced the potatoes thin, diced the onion, dropped everything into a pot, and let it simmer until the potatoes broke apart and thickened the broth into something creamy without a drop of cream. The bacon grease gave it depth, a ghost of smokiness that made it taste richer than it had any right to be. For a senior living alone on a fixed income, this was a Tuesday night miracle. Potatoes cost pennies. Onions kept for weeks, and the whole thing could be made sitting on a kitchen stool without ever lifting anything heavier than a wooden spoon. Church ladies in West Virginia still make this for homebound members. They bring it in mason jars, and it reheats perfectly the next day. Number 23, ham, bone, and bean soup. Nothing went to waste in a household that understood hunger. When the ham was eaten down to the bone itself became the next 3 meals. A senior would drop that bone into a pot with a bag of dried navy beans soaked overnight, an onion, a couple of carrots, and enough water to cover everything by 2 in. Then it simmered for 3 or 4 hours until the beans turned creamy and the broth pulled every last bit of smoky flavor from that bone. By the end, you could not tell where the broth ended and the beans began. It was thick enough to hold a spoon upright. A 1B bag of navy beans cost $69 in 1990 and fed a person for nearly a week. The ham bone was free, already paid for with Sunday's dinner. This was arithmetic. This was survival taught by mothers who never had the luxury of wasting a single thing. Seniors who made this were not following a recipe. They were following a memory. Number 22nd, cabbage and sausage pot. 1 head of cabbage, 2 or 3 smoked sausage links, a pot of water. That was the entire shopping list. You quartered the cabbage, sliced the sausage into thick coins, and let them simmer together for 45 minutes until the cabbage turned silky and sweet, and the sausage perfumed the broth with garlic and smoke. A head of cabbage cost less than $1 and could feed a person for 3 days. Smoked sausage, kept in the refrigerator for weeks without going bad. For a senior with arthritis in their hands, there was almost no knife work. You could tear the cabbage apart. You could snap the sausage links. This meal required no strength, no skills, and almost no money. Polish grandmothers in Chicago made this every week. German families in Wisconsin made it every winter. It crossed every ethnic line because poverty does not care where your people came from. Number 21, rice and canned chicken stew. When you could not get to the store, this is what you made. A can of chicken, a cup of rice, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and enough water to thin it out. Everything went into one pot. 20 minutes later, you had something that tasted like a simplified chicken and rice casserole, warm, creamy, filling. The canned chicken was already cooked. so there was no handling of raw meat with unsteady hands, no worrying about temperature or food safety, just open, dump, steerish, to stir and wait. During the 1970s and the 1980s, this became the unofficial meal of rural seniors who lived miles from the nearest grocery store. They kept their pantries stocked with canned goods like a bunker. And meals like this could be assembled without a single fresh ingredient. It was not glamorous, it was not pretty, but it kept people fed and independent when the alternative was going hungry. Number 20, chili with beans, not the Texas competition kind with hand-cut brisket and 3 kinds of dried chilies. The poor man kind, a pound of ground beef browned in a pot, a can of kidney beans, a can of tomatoes, chili powder and salt. That was the whole thing. 30 minutes and you had a pot of chili that lasted 3 days and tasted better on day 2 than day 1. For a senior cooking for one, this was the ultimate batch meal. Make it Sunday night, eat it Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday. The beans made it filling, the tomatoes made it bright, and the beef, even the cheapest tube of ground beef from the discount rack, gave it the substance that kept you going. Church food banks knew this recipe by heart. They packed the ingredients together in bags because they knew exactly who was going to make it and exactly how far it would stretch. Number 19, egg drop soup. Your grandmother did not need a Chinese restaurant to make this. She needed a pot of boiling chicken broth, 2 eggs and 60 seconds. She would bring the broth to a rolling boil, crack the eggs into a cup, beat them with a fork, then pour them in a thin stream while stirring slowly. The eggs set instantly into silky golden ribbons that floated through the broth like little clouds. A pinch of salt, a dash of pepper, done. This was the meal that seniors made when they were sick, music, when they were tired, when they had no appetite but knew they needed to eat something. The broth was hydrating, the eggs were protein, and the whole thing went down easy, warm, and gentle. A carton of broth and a couple of eggs. Less than $2, less than 5 minutes. More comfort than most things that take an hour. For a person eating alone, it was a hug in a bowl, and it asked nothing of you except to stand at the stove long enough to stir. First pattern break. Here is where things get personal. The meals on this list are not just recipes, they are survival strategies invented by people who had no one to lean on. A senior living alone faces something most cooking shows never talk about, the loneliness of making food for one. The silence of a kitchen that used to be full. The strange grief of cutting a recipe in half because the person you used to share it with is gone. These one-pot meals solved more than hunger. They solved the problem of energy. When you are 78 and your knees ache and your back hurts, and the idea of washing 3 pans makes you want to skip dinner entirely, a one-pot meal is the difference between eating and not eating, between nutrition and decline, between independence and a phone call to a child who lives 3 states away saying, "I think I need help." That is what these meals were built for, not flavor profiles, not presentation. Survival. Number 17. Lentil and carrot stew. Cup of dried lentils, 2 carrots, an onion, and a pot of water. That was the prescription depression era mothers wrote on index cards and tucked into their daughters' recipe boxes when they left home. Lentils did not need soaking like other dried beans. They cooked in 30 minutes, breaking down into a thick, earthy porridge that stuck to your ribs and kept you full for hours. The carrots added sweetness. The onion added depth, and the whole thing cost less than $1, even in the 1990s. Nutritionists now call lentils a superfood. They are packed with protein, fiber, iron, and folate. Seniors who ate them regularly, without knowing any of that, were doing better than people spending 5 times as much on supplements. A widow in Missouri told her church group she had eaten lentil stew 3 nights a week music for 11 years after her husband died. Her doctor said her iron levels were perfect. She said it was just what her mother taught her. Number 16. Corn music chowder, a creamed and kernel corn chowder, a can of creamed corn, a can of whole kernel corn, a diced potato, a cup of milk. That was the foundation of the cheapest music, most satisfying chowder many Americans ever tasted, but completely forgotten. You simmered the potato in a little water until tender, added both cans of corn music and the milk, and let the whole thing heat through until it thickened into a golden, sweet, velvety soup. Some people added a slice of bacon crumbled on top. Some added a pinch of cayenne, but the base recipe needed nothing else. The creamed corn acted as its and thickener music, so there was no making a roux, no worrying about lumps. For a senior with diabetes concerns, music, you could skip the potato entirely, and the soup was still thick enough to eat with a spoon. Music, Midwest farm wives made this when the freezer was empty and the garden was done for the season. Canned corn lasted for years. This meal waited for you until you needed it. Number 15, black-eyed music, pea stew. In the South, black-eyed peas were not just New Year's luck. They were a Wednesday night lifeline. A bag of dried black-eyed peas simmered with a ham hock, an onion, and a can of diced tomatoes until everything melted together into a thick, smoky, slightly tangy stew that tasted like the whole history of Southern poverty cooking in one bowl. The ham hock was the cheapest cut at the butcher counter, often less than $1 a pound. It existed for one purpose, to give flavor to beans, music, and it did that job better than anything else in the store. Seniors in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia made this on the first of the month when the check music came in, buying enough dried peas and ham hocks to last until the next one arrived. A single pot fed music, one person for 4 or 5 days. Served over rice, it stretched even music further. This was not cuisine, this was engineering. Number music 14. 1 pot beef and macaroni pot, 1 pound of ground beef, 1 box of elbow macaroni, 1 can of tomato sauce, 1 pot, brown the beef, drain the fat, add the macaroni and sauce, and enough water to cook the pasta, right in the same pot. In 15 minutes you had a meal that tasted like a stripped-down version of every casserole your mother ever made. Children loved it. Seniors who cooked for grandchildren kept the ingredients stocked at all times. But the real genius was for a person eating alone, because the leftovers reheated perfectly and tasted even better the second day when the sauce had soaked into the noodles. In the 1960s and 1970s, this was known simply as goulash in most American households, though it bore no resemblance to the Hungarian original. It was American poverty food wearing a borrowed name, and it kept millions of people fed without complaint. Second pattern break. Here is something the food industry does not want you to think about. These meals cost almost nothing because they use ingredients that grocery stores cannot mark up. Dried beans, potatoes, onions, rice, music, cabbage, canned tomatoes. There is no brand loyalty in a bag of lentils. There is no advertising budget behind a head of cabbage. The profit margin on a can of navy beans is pennies. That is why you never see commercials for these meals. That is why no celebrity chef builds a cookbook around potato and onion stew. The foods that keep seniors alive and independent are the foods nobody can make money from. Instead, they sell frozen dinners at $4 each that contain less nutrition than a bowl of bean soup that costs $35. The economics are not complicated. They are just cruel. Number 13, chicken and dumplings. A whole chicken cost $149 a pound in 1985, but the backs, necks, and wings cost almost nothing. A senior could buy a couple of dollars worth of bony chicken parts, simmer them in a pot of water with celery and onion until the meat fell off, pull the bones out, then drop spoonfuls of biscuit dough into the simmering broth. The dumplings puffed up, soft and pillowy, absorbing the chicken flavor as they cooked. 20 minutes covered, and the pot was full of tender chicken, thick broth, and dumplings that dissolved on the tongue. This was the meal that Southern grandmothers made when someone was grieving, sick, or just needed to feel loved. They brought it in covered pots to doorsteps across the neighborhood. For a senior cooking for one, a single batch lasted nearly a week. And every time you reheated a bowl, the kitchen smelled like someone still cared enough to cook for you. Number 12, split pea soup. A bag of split peas, a leftover ham bone, a carrot, and water, nothing else. The peas dissolved into a thick green porridge after an hour of simmering, and the ham bone gave up every last trace of smoky richness it had. The result was a soup so dense you could almost cut it with a knife. In the 1950s and the 1960s, this was standard cafeteria fare across America. Hospitals served it. Military mess halls served it. Senior centers served it because it was cheap, nutritious, and almost impossible to ruin. You could walk away from the stove, forget about it for 20 minutes, and it would not burn. It would just get thicker. For a senior with memory concerns, music, that forgiveness mattered. A pot left on low for too long did not become a disaster. It became tomorrow's lunch. The Depression generation knew this soup the way they knew their own names. It was programmed into them. Number 11. Canned salmon, patties in gravy. This entry breaks the one-pot rule slightly because the gravy was made in the same skillet. A can of salmon was mashed with a cracker or two, an egg, and a little onion, then formed into patties and fried until golden. Then you moved the patties aside, sprinkled a little flour into the drippings, added milk, and stirred until the gravy thickened. Everything went back in the pan, covered, music, and simmered for 5 minutes. Done. A can of salmon cost less than $2. $2 patties and gravy served over rice or bread fed a senior for 2 meals. The calcium from the soft bones in canned salmon was a bonus that most people never knew about. Doctors now recommend it specifically for seniors concerned about bone density. Music. Your grandmother did not know the science. She just knew it was cheap and good and held together in the pan. That was enough. Number 10, navy bean soup. If ham bone and bean soup was the Sunday version, navy bean soup was the weekend night workhorse. No bone required. Just a bag of dried navy beans, an onion, a couple stalks of celery and salt. Simmered for 2 hours until the beans burst open and the starch thickened the broth into a creamy white soup that tasted far more complex than its ingredients had any right to suggest. Some people added a splash of vinegar at the end to brighten the whole pot. Some added a bay leaf, but the base recipe worked perfectly. Music, plain. The U.S. Senate cafeteria has served navy bean soup every single day since 1903. That is not an exaggeration. It is on the menu right now. The reason is simple. It is cheap, it is filling, and every single senator who ever grew up poor recognized it as the taste of home. For a senior, a 2 lb bag of dried navy beans cost $1.50 and produced enough soup to last an entire week. Number 9, tuna noodle pot. 1 can of tuna, a handful of egg noodles, 1 can of cream of mushroom soup, frozen peas if you had them. Put everything into one pot with enough water to cook the noodles. 12 minutes and the kitchen smelled like every Wednesday night from 1955 to 1985. The cream of mushroom soup was the secret engine of American home cooking for 40 years. It turned anything it touched into something creamy and familiar. For a senior living alone, this was the meal you made with your eyes closed. No measuring, no timing, just open, dump, stir. Music. The widow in Nebraska who invented her version of this added a handful of crushed potato chips on top after serving. She said the crunch was the only thing that made her feel like she was eating a real dinner and not just surviving. Her neighbors started bringing her potato chips. Then they started bringing their own bowls. Then it became Tuesday supper at Margie's house, a one-pot meal that accidentally cured loneliness. Number 8, potato soup. The recipe was 5 potatoes, 1 onion, butter, milk, and salt. That simple list fed more American families through hard times than almost anything else on this list. You peeled and diced the potatoes, simmered them with the onion until soft, then mashed some of them right in the pot to thicken the broth. A splash of milk and a pat of butter turned it creamy. The whole thing took 30 minutes. Music, and cost less than $2. For a senior, potato soup had one crucial advantage. It was soft. No chewing required. For someone with dental problems, missing teeth, music, or ill-fitting dentures, this was not just convenient. It was the difference between eating a proper supper and giving up on food altogether. The Depression generation did not talk about dental care because most of them could not afford it. They just quietly adapted their cooking until everything was soft enough to eat without teeth. Potato soup was the centerpiece of that adaptation. Third pattern break. Music. Here is what nobody says out loud. Half the seniors in America who live alone skip music meals, not because they forgot, not because they are not hungry, because cooking for one feels pointless. The table is too quiet, the portion is too small. The effort does not seem worth it when there is nobody across the table to share it with. These one-pot meals were the answer to that silence, not because they were exciting, but because they were possible. You could make them tired. Music. You could make them sad. You could make them with aching hands and a bad back and a kitchen that had not been properly cleaned in a week. They met you where you were. That was their genius. Music, not flavor, not technique, accessibility. The most important ingredient in every single one of these meals, music, was not beans or potatoes or broth. It was the fact that someone could actually make it. Number 7, sausage and white bean stew, smoked sausage sliced into rounds, a can of white beans drained, a can of diced tomatoes, a handful of spinach if you had it, but it worked without. Music. Everything in one pot simmered for 20 minutes. The sausage gave it smokiness. The beans made it hearty. The tomatoes gave it brightness. Music. And the spinach wilting into the broth added on that most seniors were not getting enough of. This was the one-pot meal that actually looked like a real dinner. You could serve it in a bowl and feel like you had cooked music. Something, for a senior who was starting to lose interest in eating, that mattered more than the nutrition facts. The psychology of food is real. A meal that looks like a meal makes you feel like a person. A sleeve of crackers eaten over the sink does not. Number 6. Vegetable beef soup. A pound of stew meat. Whatever vegetables were in the crisper, a can of tomatoes, water. This was the clean-out-the-fridge meal that every resourceful cook knew by heart. Celery going limp, carrots getting soft, half an onion wrapped in plastic, a potato with eyes starting to sprout. Into the pot, all of it. The stew meat browned first, then everything else piled on top and simmered for an hour until the kitchen windows fogged and the broth turned into something deeply savory. For a senior, this meal prevented food waste, which prevented guilt, which prevented the slow spiral of feeling like you could not manage your own kitchen anymore. Every bowl was different. Every batch used what was there. And no two pots ever tasted the same, which meant no two nights felt exactly the same either. That small variety kept things interesting. That mattered. Number 5. Red beans and rice. A pound of dried red kidney beans, a smoked sausage link, an onion, a green pepper, a stalk of celery, cooked low and slow in one pot until the beans turned creamy and the sausage gave up its smoky soul to the broth music, served over rice. This was the Monday meal of New Orleans, born from the tradition of washing clothes all day while supper simmered on the back burner. For a senior, the beauty was exactly that, unattended. You put the pot on the stove at noon and came back at 5. No stirring, no checking, no standing. The beans did their own work, and the finished product was so rich, so deeply flavored, so filling that you forgot you had spent less than $3 on the whole pot. Louis Armstrong signed his letters red beans and rice leers. That was not a joke. That was a man who never forgot where his food came from. Number 4. Depression stew. Music. This was the meal a steel worker in Pittsburgh ate for 3 years. Ground beef browned in a pot, a can of tomatoes, a can of corn, 2 diced potatoes, water, salt, pepper. That was it. The potatoes thickened the broth as they cooked. The corn added sweetness. The tomatoes gave it acid. The beef, even the cheapest ground beef available, turned it into a meal that held you until morning. This recipe appeared in Depression-era cookbooks with no name, just stew. Housewives penciled it into margins. Mothers whispered it to daughters on their wedding day like a secret. It was the recipe that said, no matter how bad things get, you can eat tonight. For a senior living on Social Security, this stew was more than dinner. It was defiance. It was the quiet refusal to be beaten by a fixed income and an empty kitchen. A single pot lasted 4 days. A single pot cost less than $5. A single pot kept a man alive and independent until the age of 91. Number 3. Chicken thigh and rice pot. Chicken thighs were the forgotten cut. For decades, they cost half the price of breasts because Americans were convinced white meat was better. Seniors who knew better bought thighs for 69 cents a pound and made a meal that tasted twice as rich. You browned the thighs in a pot, added a cup of rice, a can of chicken broth, and whatever seasoning you had. Then you covered the pot and simmered it for 30 minutes. The rice absorbed every drop of the chicken-flavored broth, and the thighs, dark and tender, fell apart at the touch of a fork. Fat in the thighs was the whole secret. It kept the rice moist, and the meat succulent in a way that boneless, skinless chicken breasts never could. For a senior with a dwindling appetite, the richness of dark meat made the difference between pushing food around the plate and actually finishing a meal. This was the dish that grandmothers made without thinking. That automatic muscle memory meal came out the same every time and tasted like the kitchen was still alive. Number 2. Pinto beans and cornbread. This was not technically one pot, but the cornbread baked in the same cast iron skillet that had been seasoned by 60 years of use, and the beans simmered in the only other pot the kitchen needed. A bag of dried pinto beans cooked low for 3 hours with salt pork or ham hock until the broth turned thick and brown and the beans turned creamy. The cornbread, golden and crackling, was flipped out of the skillet in one piece and broken into chunks to soak up the bean liquor. For families across the rural South, the Ozarks and the Plains states, this was not a meal. It was the meal, the one that defined poverty cooking for 100 years. Pinto beans were the cheapest source of protein in the American grow. Surrey store, and they still are. A senior who kept a bag of pintos and a box of cornmeal in the cupboard would never go hungry ever. There was nothing fancy about it. There was nothing to photograph or post or brag about. There was only a full belly and the knowledge that tomorrow you could do it again. Number 1. Chicken soup. A whole chicken in a pot of water with carrots, celery, onion, and salt. It was simmered for 2 hours until the house smelled like someone's grandmother lived there. The broth turned golden. The chicken fell apart. The vegetables softened into the most basic, most nourishing, most healing meal human beings have ever invented. Every culture has a version. Every generation passes it down. For a senior living alone, a pot of chicken soup was more than nutrition. It was a connection to every person who had ever made it for them. Every sick day, every cold winter, every heartbreak, it was the taste of being taken care of. When you make it for yourself alone in a quiet kitchen with no one to share it with, it still works. The steam still rises, the broth still warms, and somewhere in the smell of it, you remember that you are worth the trouble of cooking. Here is my challenge: make one of these this week, just one. The potato soup, the lentil stew, the chicken and rice. Then sit down at the table, not the couch. Set a place. Music, eat it slow, because these meals were never just about being cheap. They were about staying alive and staying human when the world made it easy to stop trying. Share which one you are going to make in the comments. I want to know if the depression stew gets more love than the pinto beans. I want to know if anyone else's grandmother signed her letters the way Louis Armstrong did, because these are not just recipes. They are proof that the simplest food made in one pot, eaten alone, can still be an act of dignity.